question of violence as a means for social change brings into stark relief that there are many Nelson Mandelas, the passive resistance activist, the militant revolutionary, and the constitutionalist, only to name a few. Each of these figures suggests multiple mythic and embodied meanings of Mandela, and in turn, multiple meanings of violence in South Africa, where I focus my comments. In 1946, as a young lawyer, Mandela defended the poor people's movement Sofe Sonke, the We Die Together campaign, in their illegal land occupations. After his Gandhian-inspired defiance campaign in 1952, Mandela helped form Umkhonto we Sizwe, the Spear of the Nation, the military wing of the African National Congress. In his famous Rivonia trial speech, the last he would make before spending 27 years in prison, he reveals his views of violence as complex and historically contingent. Quote, "After a long and anxious assessment of the South African situation, we came to the conclusion that as violence in this country was inevitable, it would be unrealistic and wrong for African leaders to continue preaching peace and nonviolence at a time when the government met our peaceful demands with force. It was only when all else had failed, when all channels of peaceful protest had been barred to us, that the decision was made to embark on violent forms of political struggle. We did so not because we desired such a course, but solely because the government had left us no other choice. The time comes in the life of any nation when there remains only two choices, submit or fight. That time has now come to South Africa. We shall not submit, and we have no choice but to hit back by all means in our power to the defense of our people, our future, and our freedom." He challenges us to rethink when peace becomes a force of violence. When is violence an instrument of liberation? Serenity in a war zone, love in the midst of hate, freedom in a jail cell, and nonviolence as a form of violence.
So first, I think I should say that my answer to this question of when violence is justified is based on asking a lot more context-specific questions. Who's using the violence? What is the social and political change that they're seeking to achieve? How and why was the decision made to opt for violence? What kind of violence is being used? Who is being targeted? What was the precipitating event? What other options have been ruled out? What are the peripheral effects of this violence? And if I'm being honest, there's part of me that's very much drawn to the response of the pacifist. There's part of me that very much wants to say, no violence is ever justified in struggles in a transition from one kind of regime to another, that violence, as we've already heard, is bound to have a dehumanizing effect, and that it's also likely to have a negative impact on the society that emerges. But ultimately, I think that that answer is probably not totally satisfying, that we may have to face the reality that sometimes there are governments that are just so cruel, so evil, so unjust that people may need to resist by force. And my concern in those contexts is that insistence on nonviolence might sometimes lead to greater injustice, that in some circumstances, force might be the last way to appeal to dignity and to human rights. It's the justifications that were given by the ANC when it decided to turn towards armed struggle and abandon 49 years of nonviolence. Because it seems to me like if ever you could justify a decision to turn to violence, it would be in a context like apartheid South Africa. So to take three of those justifications, the first one is that, of course, the cause was just, that apartheid itself was a crime against humanity, that you're talking about a systematic regime of oppression, of racial segregation, whose very purpose is to ensure the white majority has control over all kinds of power, wealth, resources, politics, and that the black majority is oppressed and has essentially no rights. And then apartheid as a crime against humanity is enforced by numerous other international crimes and violations ranging from exile, arbitrary arrest and detention, through extrajudicial killings and torture. So you have a situation in which the rule of law is totally absent, in which there's no meaningful recourse to the courts, in which the legal system is actually perpetuating the crime. So to me, I find this justification fairly convincing. If Nazi Germany is sort of the paradigmatic example of a situation in which violence may be justified, apartheid South Africa is a very close second. A second justification that was given at the time was that the turn to violence was a last resort, that it was necessary, that it was self-defense. And I think especially in the wake of the Sharpeville massacre, that that was really a turning point. Tutu said about Sharpeville, it told us that even if we protested peacefully, we would be picked off like vermin, and that black life was of little consequence. So prior to Sharpeville, I think you have all of the state institutions sort of compressing the arena in which the ANC could operate legally. After Sharpeville, you have a total shutting down of those possibilities. The ANC is banned, a state of emergency is imposed. So I can understand how at that time the turn to violence would have seemed imperative. We already had Carrie give us the quote from the Rivonia trial, and I think Mandela was clear that there was no other means in order to secure the future and the freedom that was desired. Linked to this sort of last resort necessity argument was another argument about needing to give some kind of coherence to the violence. I think that there was a concern that civil war was about to break out, that it was going to be a racially fueled civil war, and that it was going to make it infinitely harder to create the racial harmony that was so desired. So the idea was that the ANC could channel that violence towards the apartheid state itself and perhaps away from individuals, be they black or white. I find this justification slightly less persuasive, in part because I think about sort of the strategic gains and losses and the effectiveness or lack of effectiveness of the violence itself. I think there's a fairly good argument to be made that at certain points the turn to violence was actually counterproductive, that the sabotage and bombing campaigns might have actually weakened the movement overall, because the entire movement could then be treated by the apartheid government as if it was all violent. It was used to justify even more repressive crackdowns. It cost the AMC some support at home and abroad, and I think perhaps more seriously, it turned, at least for a time, the ANC's attention away from other options like boycotts, like strikes, like the ungovernability campaign that I think eventually led to apartheid's demise.
No one is for violence. Violence is usually, violence is a terrible thing, the deployment of violence. My answer to the question would be, however, that violence is justifiable when one can confidently predict that the violence that one is deploying will eliminate a greater evil. That's always a very difficult judgment to make. One has to consider a wide variety of things. Again, many of them have already been mentioned. You know, one reason why people, even in the most terrible of circumstances, don't resort to violence is because the resort to violence would lead to suicide, essentially be suicidal. If you are if you're in an oppressive situation, your oppressors typically have more access to the means of violence than you do. So just, self-preservation will lead one often not to engage in violence. Another issue that has been mentioned, and I think it's one that maybe I hope that in question and answer we will talk about, because violence is a tainting thing, one always has to consider, even if one thinks that one can prevail, what will be the price that one pays for doing that?
So the question is, and I agree with Professor Ronald Kennedy, sometimes you have to make calculation, is cost-benefit analysis. I like quoting things. This is the very dirty quote, but I will say it nevertheless. It is only when a mosquito lands on your testicles that you know that there are other non-violent ways of solving problems. It has always been that there are people who want to retain the status quo, and they are willing and ready to use violence to ensure that they protect their privileges. And there are people who want to see change. They have an alternative world, or they may not even have an alternative world view, social and political, but they are against what exists. If we look at the current structure, economically, the violence, the economic violence, and I like that, I think is sometimes even more damaging than the physical violence we see. And you cannot talk, in most cases, about physical violence without really looking at the underlying causes. And mostly, they have to do with the political structure and economic structure that we have globalized. The neoliberal idea of privatizing everything, of making certain few individuals rich, has actually made the poor poorer and the rich richer. And I will give you Nigeria as an example. You read on daily basis on news that most of the emerging economies in the world are in Africa. Nigeria is one of the fastest growing economy. It has one of the largest producers of oil in the world, and it is like the future of Africa. But you go to Nigeria, you go to certain places, you realize that all the benefits goes to certain few parts of the country or few individuals. And then you begin to ask now, what happened to the overwhelming majority who are poor and angry? And there is another saying which says that one day the poor will have nothing to eat but the rich. And when that day comes, I think it's not going to be good for us. And I think every violence you think of can be associated with dissatisfaction. It's not as irrational as we may sometimes tend to present it. Sometimes there is we may disagree with the rationale, but certainly behind every violence and behind every revolt, there are some legitimate grievances, perhaps not articulated properly, perhaps because they have been pushed into a corner.
You know, I think people know that Nelson Mandela, for instance, embraced Fidel Castro. People know that Nelson Mandela viewed himself as a revolutionary. I think people know that Nelson Mandela, had he had more force, would have probably imposed a different set of requirements for reconciliation. I mean, the fact of the matter is the African National Congress did not have the power to overthrow their masters, and so they had to make do. I mean, I think people are aware of that. I mean, in a way, Nelson Mandela was, because of the weakness, the military weakness of his forces, had to engage in a reconciliation that has still left the great masses of black South Africans in a very, in a terrible situation. I think many people know that. It's true that after his death, there was, in a lot of precincts, a sort of a whitewashing of Nelson Mandela. But I mean, that often happens.